few years back, I was driving from 29 Palms, California to Albuquerque, New Mexico. 29 Palms is located in the desolate high desert east of Los Angeles, and except for passing through Amboy, the road between the two is a total wilderness. Amboy is pretty much a ghost town with a dormant volcano on one side and a salt flat on the other. It also happened to be a hotspot of Church of Satan activity back in the 1970s, but that's another story entirely. Anyway, I stopped in Amboy and snapped a picture of the city sign, just to prove that I was there to friends who dared me to take that route to I-40. Then I got back in my car and carried on with the journey. A few minutes later, I'm driving through a grassy canyon when I see some stuff in the middle of the road. I slow down to see a red Pontiac Fiero stopped sideways across both lanes, an open suitcase with clothes scattered everywhere, two bodies lying face down in the road, a man and a woman. Immediately, I stop my car, jump out of the driver's side with my phone in hand, and start jogging over to the motionless couple while shouting, "Hey, are you okay?" I don't get a response, so I unlock my phone to start dialing 911. Then just as I start telling the operator that there had been a car accident, I notice something weird about the unconscious guy. For someone who evidently had been thrown from a motor vehicle, he had very little damage to his head. Sure, he was covered in blood, but I'd seen accidents where the bodies were a mess. These just looked too clean. I can picture the moment the man started to move like it was yesterday, and the hope I felt that he was still alive. Only, the thing was, he was still alive. Only that wasn't a good thing. Not for me, anyway. Because out of nowhere, as I'm talking to the 911 dispatcher, the guy just launches himself to his feet and begins to sprint directly at me. I just reacted, getting back into my car and zooming past him and his female partner, who was also back on her feet and chasing me by the time I got out of there. The whole thing had been an elaborate ambush. Two tweakers who decided to stage a car crash to trick drivers into stopping and getting out. And the scary thing is, it almost worked. The Summer of Love. Most of you will at least be familiar with the phrase, and those that aren't will definitely be familiar with those who took part. Hippies, flower children, beatniks, all jamming out to the likes of Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, or Captain Beefheart and his magic band. Well, at the risk of becoming a walking cliche, I was there, man. I was at the very center of the hippie movement when it was at its absolute zenith, and I was there when it all came crashing down, too. For me, it all started with this festival in San Francisco called Human Be-In that took place in early '67. I was living with my parents back in Ohio at the time, and I remember hearing about the event on the radio one night, tuning in just in time to hear Tim Leary saying, "Turn on, tune in, drop out." I didn't understand exactly what he meant by that at the time, but the attitude behind his words was dead clear. All-out cultural rebellion. A kind of tension had been brewing in America for maybe 10 years prior to that point. Everyone could feel it, and for a plethora of different reasons, everyone felt that if it was going to erupt anywhere, it would be in San Francisco. That kind of momentum kept building and building until I think May of '67 when the Mamas and the Papas released the song San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair. I think a lot of people still know the song, but I think the cause and effect have been completely forgotten. See, it wasn't just some jingly little pop song. It was like a rallying cry, a call to all the disenfranchised to descend on San Francisco. And you can bet your bottom dollar they wore flowers in their hair too. They say as many as 100,000 hippies arrived in San Francisco that summer, and like I said, I was one of them. And boy, was it an adventure. But there was a darker side to the Summer of Love, one that I don't hear people talking about a lot. This dark underbelly might best be encapsulated with the story of the Manson family. But take it from me, Charlie Manson wasn't the only person who took advantage of the hippie movement and all the vulnerable young souls that moved with it. When I first landed in Frisco, I had about $6 to my name, one change of clothes, and I desperately needed a place to stay. Another hippie told me to head over to the neighborhood called Haight-Ashbury, because that was where all the local hippies had converged to open up head shops and the like. So I headed up there, got talking to some folks from Kentucky, and that's how I managed to find a place to stay for the first few days. After we got kicked out of that place, no one was paying any rent to the owner. We all went our separate ways, and for a few hours before sunset, it was looking like I was going to have to spend the night outdoors. And that's when I meet this girl who called herself Bluebell. Bluebell was definitely on something when I first met her, because she kept singing this dumb repetitive song that went, "Bluebells are bluebells, 'cause bluebells are blue." I told her about my lack of accommodation, and she told me I was more than welcome to stay with her and her friends at a derelict house they'd fixed up together. They didn't have any power, but they did have running water and a few spare mattresses, but that was more than good enough for me. The only price was that everyone had to contribute at least one item to every evening meal. That sounded easy enough, so I accepted her invitation, then asked why she'd picked the name Bluebell. She tells me she didn't pick it, that Zero had given it to her. Then when I asked her who Zero is, she just laughed and tells me, "You're about to find out." After about 10 minutes of walking, we ended up outside this nice-looking townhouse, but the neat middle-class exterior bellied the chaos inside. It had been well and truly occupied by Bluebell's hippie cohort. Every single room apart from the kitchen and the bathroom had been converted into these multifunctional living spaces. There had to be at least 15 to 20 young folk from all over the US, all packed into a house that should have catered to no more than 5. But like I said, I needed a place to stay, and although those guys seemed crazy, they welcomed me with open arms, especially their leader, a guy named Zero. He lived up in the attic of the building, and right away you could tell he was this total sort of messiah figure to them. Long dark hair, scraggly beard. He looked every part the hippie Jesus figure the others made him out to be. I thought it was kind of creepy that most of the girls stayed up in the attic with him, but at the time I figured he's a popular guy. Makes sense, right? Anyways, the first few days were just peachy. Since I was new in town, I wasn't expected to contribute too much, and I pulled my weight by performing a few odd jobs around the house. It wasn't until I was expected to contribute to the group's food supply that I noticed that something was off. When asked to contribute, I offered to get a part-time job someplace, maybe cut a few square folks' lawns for a few bucks here and there. But my new friends explained to me, "Nah, man, you got it all wrong. We just take what we need, but no more than that, so it's cool." By take, they meant steal. But it wasn't even like they were stealing from Ralph's or whatever. It was like mom and pop stores. Then when I asked how they could justify that, they gave me some nonsense about how capitalism was evil and that it wouldn't matter soon because the revolution was coming and we'd all soon be liberated from it. At the time, I just soaked up their excuses, nodded along, and did as I was told. Besides, I didn't have too much time to think about it because, my God, did the acid flow like water. Anytime anything good happened, we dosed. Anytime anything bad happened, we dosed. We dosed in the morning, we dosed after dinner. Are you beginning to see a pattern here? But the time you could always expect a dose was if you questioned the group, and especially if you questioned Zero. I was just so naive. I didn't understand what he was doing at the time, but he was basically using LSD as a brainwashing drug. He'd dose you, then just talk you around to his way of thinking until you could barely even remember what the problem was to begin with. That's how he convinced us to lie, how he convinced us to steal, and how he convinced us to do much, much worse things too. About 6 weeks into my stay at Zero's place, a girl named Angela arrived. She was a super Christian girl who'd become interested in the hippie movement due to her anti-war stance. She'd lost a brother in Vietnam and her entire family were heartbroken. She just didn't want anyone else to go through what her family had suffered. She was sweet like that, a genuine heart of gold. She was pretty too, real pretty, and Zero took a liking to her straight away, so much so that he basically demoted one of the girls who slept up in the attic with him. And let me tell you, she wasn't pleased about that at all. But as it usually goes, She got a dose and a talking to, then everything was miraculously smoothed over. And that brings me to the subject of Angela and drugs. Because she was so hardcore Christian, she didn't want to do any of the trippy stuff we did. Most people respected that, but two people were very, very insistent on getting her to try LSD for the first time. The first was the girl she replaced in Zero's room, and the second was Zero himself. She was steadfast, at first anyway, and told them she didn't need those things to love and appreciate. But over the course of a few weeks, Zero wore her down. Seeing what they did to that girl was the beginning of my disillusionment, and by the time it ended, I wanted out. Because one night, Zero wanted to be alone up in his room with Angela. We all figured he was going to, but we figured it'd all be safe and consensual. Free love was big at the time, and we figured it was only a matter of time before Angela got on board with the love train. Their little date went on late into the night, and the whole time, I had a bad feeling. It was rare for anyone to be alone for that amount of time, even Zero and one of his girls. I was wide awake when Zero and one of his closest male followers were walking around the house. I didn't know what they were doing, but it didn't sound like they were up to anything good. The whole time I'm still kind of worried, but also assuming that Angela is safe up in the attic. Yet the next day, she was nowhere to be seen. I asked around, and no one had spoken to her, and when I asked Zero where she was, he called a house meeting. I'm pretty sure you can guess what he did at the start of this house meeting. Yeah, we dosed. So Zero talks about this, and for a while, waiting for the acid to kick in, and only when it does is the conversation about Angela started. What happened was a long, complicated talk, and my memory of it is definitely patchy, so here's the summation. Zero basically told us that Angela didn't exist, or rather, that a girl named Angela had stayed for a few nights during the previous month but had moved on shortly after. After all our interactions had been, how do I put this, echoes of her spirit, because she'd brought us so much love to the group, love that had, stuck to us after she departed. That's definitely some bad paraphrasing on my part, but you get the gist. It was horrifying. The group just ate it up, and I knew something terrible had happened to Angela, something he was trying to hide. To this day, I don't know what happened to Angela, and I don't know if the cops had showed up to look around for her, or if they indicated something truly sinister happened, or if she'd run away from home and her parents had called the police for that specific reason. Though I do know that they were very interested in talking to Zero. I don't know if they ever caught up with him, as I moved out of that place long after Angela disappeared. But I did end up catching up with one of the old roommates shortly before I left San Francisco. When I asked them how he was doing, their answer was the final nail in the hippie coffin for me. Who? They asked. I reiterated, unable to believe they didn't know who I was talking about. Then when the penny dropped, they just laughed and said, "Dude, Zero doesn't exist. He never existed." For almost 3 years, I was homeless in my native state of California, and they were without a doubt the 3 most soul-crushing years of my life. It all started with a high school basketball injury that got me hooked on oxys. After that, it was just a matter of time before I tried something harder, and before long, I started snorting and smoking smack while telling myself I was just a weekend warrior and not a full-time addict. As you can probably tell from how this story opened, that didn't go so well. Heroin took over my life and I ended up on the streets. But you know the worst thing? Even when I was at rock bottom, even when I was facing my first night on the streets, because SoCal is just so warm and pretty much all year round, I told myself, I'm doing all right. Needless to say, I was not. The first really horrible thing I heard about was when a bunch of my junkie buddies drowned in a flash flood. They all used to stay in this concrete drainage ditch, and sometimes I'd sleep down there too whenever we were using together. But then one night, this freak rainstorm dropped so much water on Southern California that a flash flood took them before they even knew what hit them. 5 out of the 6 guys down there drowned, all because they were high at the time of the flood. It should have been my wake-up call, but heroin always has a way of convincing you otherwise. Then there was a homeless shelter I stayed in for a time, one with a segregated men's side and a woman's side. It turned out like 2/3 of the men there were convicted offenders or were suspected of similar crimes, some of which had been committed against women who were actually in the same facility. Half the reason we were even kept apart in the first place was because of the danger some of those guys posed. But the truly horrifying thing, assaults happened on site, way more than anyone wanted to admit, and the victims were actively discouraged from telling anyone, especially the cops, what had happened. If they filed a report with the police, they were permanently barred from the shelter, and some had their records disposed of, anything to keep the reputation of the shelter from falling into disrepute. At one point, I tried getting some money together to get a train up to NorCal, but the end of my heroin cravings had been sated, and I only had enough money for bus fare to Fresno. I tried hitchhiking, hoping someone might look past my raggedy appearance, but no. And by the time the sun went down, I had decided to try my luck at sleeping in a nearby barn, and I woke up to a shotgun in my face. I must have left the barn door slightly ajar or whatever because the farmer came out with a shotgun and threatened to blow my head off unless I showed him my hands. Once I explained what the situation was, the guy actually lowered the shotgun, invited me inside, cooked me breakfast, and let me use his shower. That was one of the worst things, to be honest, not knowing if a stranger was going to be a total jerk or the kindest person on earth. That attitude stuck with me for a long time after, and I can safely say that kind of attitude completely fried my nerves. Another time, I made friends with this homeless couple and stuck with them for a while. They seemed really loving and chill, but they both had real bad meth problems, and I was about to get a serious lesson in just how volatile meth heads could be. I'm lying in my sleeping bag in early December, and it's the middle of the night when I wake up to the feeling of someone sitting down on the end of my sleeping bag. I only had it half on me, as you always gotta be ready to throw it off to either run or fight. So the male half of the couple just plants himself on the empty half and just seems to sit there. I'm like, "Yo dude, what's up, trying to sleep here?" And in response, he just gurgles. It's only then that I sit up to see him holding onto his neck, and there's all this blood just pumping between his fingers. There was a payphone nearby, so I just jump out of my bag, telling him I'm going to call 911, but he actually grabs my coat and tries to stop me. He can barely talk because his freaking throat had been cut, but he's telling me to not, coughing up blood between every word. I just ignored him, thinking he was just worried about the cops finding a stash or something, but I wasn't about to let this guy bleed out of my sleeping bag just because he had some dust and a baggie on him. EMTs come and take him away, and that's all I hear about for a few days, and the couple just totally dropped off the face of the earth. About a month later, I run into the couple while I'm hanging with another dude, and he has this huge scar on his neck. We say hi, make some small talk, and by that I mean swap dealer info, then go our separate ways. When they were out of earshot, my new buddy asked me if I know how that guy got his throat cut. I tell him no, urging him to spit it out if he knew. It turns out, the female half of the couple did it. She couldn't find her crystal one night, assumed the guy had smoked it up, so she legitimately tried to kill him. Then, there they were, a month later, acting like nothing happened. Jesus. Then there was this time I was totally out of luck and was going through withdrawals on a park bench down in Van Nuys. The horror of opiate withdrawal had been elaborated on in like 100 different movies and books, so I won't go into it. But let me just say that they are honestly every bit as horrendous as you can imagine. Now I'm right in the middle of the phase when you're just too sick to move, and the only thing that was getting me through was being able to see this lit-up window across the street. There was what looked like a new mom or a nanny with this tiny baby in her arms, and they were like gently bouncing up and down. It looked like the most comfortable thing in the world, and for a few short moments, it made me forget how much I wanted to die. Then suddenly, someone steps in front of the light, someone whose face I couldn't see, but I knew they were looking at me. I knew that for whatever reason, They just stopped to stare at me as I lay there shivering and wheezing. I was completely helpless, completely at the will of this anonymous stranger. They could have done anything that they wanted to me. Anything. And I don't think I've been able to lift a single finger to stop them. I know that's not as graphic or overtly horrifying as a dude getting stabbed in the neck, but when I think of all the scariest moments from being homeless, that's in the top 3 every time. But thankfully, in the end, they just walked off. Didn't even ask if I needed medical attention, but honestly, I'm not resentful they didn't ask. I'm just more glad they didn't make the situation worse. Okay, so remember I told you I lived in that messed up shelter for a while? Well, it was in a really, really sketchy part of Stockton, and the place had a curfew of 10 p.m., so either you were back by then, or you were locked out for the night. So this one night, I'm like power walking back to the shelter when I see that some total jerk has set a rug on fire down in an alleyway, presumably to dispose of it or something. So my eyes are glued to this thing thinking, who in God's name would do something like that? When the rug sits up and screams. From what I heard later, someone had gotten so sick of this guy getting drunk and passing out behind their house that they went out and just set the guy on fire. And I'm the unfortunate SOB to come walking up on it just seconds after it happened. I scream at the guy to roll, until we finally got the message. He managed to get the fire out, but I'm pretty sure he died before the EMTs could get him to the hospital. I still can't watch movies where people get set on fire. Just bring those memories back fresh in my mind. Another time, we heard this one crazy cook out in San Bernardino was giving away free samples. He'd come up with this new way of cooking meth, but he didn't know if it was safe or not, so we all had to meet near this gas station. Before you call out the free sample thing, this cook was nuts, and he'd done it before, go figure. I didn't do any meth, but me and a buddy figured we could grab the free sample, then swap it for dope with someone back on Skid Row. Turned out the whole free sample thing was a trick because this gas station happened to be right next to an overpass. Once enough tweakers had gathered, this cook dragged a 17-year-old girl up onto the overpass and then threw her off because she owed him money. It was supposed to be like a message to the other tweakers, and the girl died of her injuries, obviously. Finally, the thing that still sticks with me even today is how cruel kids and teenagers can be towards homeless folks. It's always boys, always, and it doesn't always get violent, but you see enough of it to actually fear these ache-stricken 5'0" jerks, not because they're big and strong, just because they're evil. I remember asking this kid, he couldn't have been older than maybe 16, if he had any spare change for me. He literally rattled all the change in his pocket, gave me this big poop-eating grin and said, "Sure, I got a whole bunch of change. I got so much I don't know what to do with it all." Another kid, on a different occasion, actually got out his wallet, took out maybe $2 in change, then just tossed it into a storm drain, way out of my reach. Most of that stuff just makes me angry, but the scary part is that I know well people don't really mature past a certain age. They tend to just get better at hiding what monsters they are. And to think these kids go on to take up positions of power or privilege is just terrifying to me. Anyway, after the incident with the tweaker girl, I hit rock bottom, and I almost overdosed after totally misjudging the strength of some new dealer stash. I woke up in the hospital. My mom and dad were there, and the conversation we had, once I was able to speak, ended up setting me up on the road to recovery. I don't think I'm all the way healed yet. Like I said, movies with flaming bodies really bother me, and I find myself almost totally unable to trust anyone outside of my immediate family. But I'm getting there. Every day I'm getting closer to being a complete person, but at the same time, I think there will always be a piece of me that I left out in the streets. And honestly, I'd like to keep it that way. Thanks for reading, and look after each other. On the night of February 29th, 1960, Julian and Mercedes Ramirez welcomed their youngest child into the world. At the time, Julian was supporting his large family of 5 children by working as a laborer on the AT&SF railway. It was a tough job with meager pay, but it was a positively luxurious one compared to his previous employment, because Julian was a Mexican migrant and he previously held a position as a police officer in Ciudad Juarez. Even back in the 1950s and 60s, Juarez's proximity to the U.S. border made it a strategically vital location for narco-traffickers and people smugglers. Police corruption and bribery were rampant, and officers were often the subject of targeted assassinations, making life for Juarez law enforcement almost unbearable. It's more than likely that Julian saw some horrifying things during his time in uniform, and this would certainly amount for his heavy drinking and violent outbursts, both hallmarks of complex PTSD. And for his youngest son, Richie, domestic violence became a feature of his daily life from a very young age, with the young boy often resorting to sleeping in a local cemetery whenever his father's mood grew too volatile. Around the age of 12, Richie began hanging out with his adult cousin, Mike. Mike was a decorated Vietnam veteran who'd served several tours with the Green Berets, but it would be foolish to assume that this made him a man of honor or service, because in truth, Mike was a violent psychopath who had committed countless war crimes during his time in Vietnam. Not only that, but Mike had taken numerous Polaroid photographs of his victims both before and after he'd assaulted and murdered them. Pictures of young Vietnamese women tied to trees, weeping as they begged for their lives in a language their captors didn't care to understand. Richard's horrific still-life progression of these poor young women from bound and terrified to lifeless and headless, with Mike often holding up their severed heads, a sick smile stretched across his lips. Mike was fond of sharing these pictures with young Richie, and it would be hard to understate the devastating effect these photos had on his young mind. Because Richie wasn't repulsed by the photographs. On the contrary, by his own admission, he was fascinated with them, and they seemed to have sparked a morbid obsession in Richie that would have a profound influence on his adult life. At 13, Richie's fixation with violent imagery grew even deeper when he witnessed Mike murder his wife, Jessie, by shooting her in the face during a domestic dispute. But again, instead of terrifying and disgusting the young Richie, he discovered that witnessing death up close actually excited him in the extreme. But the conundrum of how to come to terms with his newfound feeling caused Richie to become increasingly alienated from his family and friends. He ended up moving into his older sister's place, where he discovered that her husband was a frequent LSD user, as well as what's known as a peeping Tom. This is when men would venture out into the night in the hopes of spying on women through their windows, a mostly defunct activity in the age of the internet, but one that thrilled young Richie. It also seems to have had a profound influence on him because it seems this perverted nocturnal activity laid the groundwork for his horrific future crimes, because young Richie is perhaps better known as Richard Ramirez, or as the media would come to name him, the Night Stalker. By the age of 22, Richard had moved out to California and was living in an apartment building in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Around 18 months into his stay there, a 9-year-old Chinese-American girl by the name of Mei Liang was playing around with her younger brother when she apparently lost a $1 bill somewhere in the building. Richard approached the girl and, with a warm smile, told her he'd seen a loose $1 bill in the building's basement. Agreeing to show her where it was, Richard had the young girl follow him down the stairs into the dark, dingy basement. She would never come out, alive. Ramirez beat her, choked her, then stabbed her to death with a switchblade. Once she had passed, he hung her body from a drain pipe, then fled the area. Initially, authorities didn't realize May's murder was the first of the Night Stalker killings, but a 2009 DNA match determined Ramirez was responsible, and it's now commonly accepted that she was the first of his victims, and she would be the first of many. On June 28th of 1984, 79-year-old Jeannie Vincao was found dead in her northeast Los Angeles apartment. She had multiple stab wounds to her head, neck, and chest, apparently inflicted while she was asleep in her bed. Forensic examiners would later discover that her throat had been slashed so deeply that she'd almost been completely beheaded. It was a horrifying crime scene, but thankfully, police had a lead. A single fingerprint had been pulled from a mesh screen the killer had removed to gain access to the property. Yet given that this print failed to match any in their database, it seemed police would have to be patient in order to catch their man. But the killer was patient too, waiting almost an entire year before making his next move. On March 17th of 1985, 22-year-old Maria Hernandez was attacked outside her home in Rosemead. As she pulled into her driveway, a man had emerged from the shadows, pulled a .22 caliber handgun from his pocket, and fired it at her face. The only thing that saved Maria's life was the fact that she'd raised her hands to her face in the blind panic, hands that just so happened to be holding her car keys. This meant the bullet that would have ripped through her skull was deflected away from her, causing only superficial cuts to her face. Maria was terrified, but she was smart enough to slump over in the driver's seat and play dead. She thought this would satisfy her attacker, prompting his escape, but the shooter had only begun. He walked into the home that Maria shared with her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Yoshi Okazaki, who, having heard the gunfire, was taking cover behind a counter. When Dale heard someone walking into the house, she peeked out from behind the counter, thinking it might have been Maria. But as she raised her head, all she saw was a stick-thin man with long curly brown hair, deep dark bulging eyes, and wide-spaced rotting teeth. He was pointing a pistol right at her and would be the last image she'd ever see. Within an hour of the Rosemead attack, 30-year-old Chua Lian Yu was dragged from her car in Monterey Park. Then he shot her twice with a .22 caliber handgun. She was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital, with witnesses describing an attacker who looked an awful lot like the Rosemead murderer. The murders obviously attracted a great deal of media attention, but no one could have possibly guessed just how many people would fall victim to one of the evilest men ever to walk the streets of California. Just 10 days later, in the wee small hours of March 27th, 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara and his wife Maxine were asleep at their house in Whittier. At around 2 a.m., Maxine was suddenly awakened by a loud crack and sat up in bed to find her husband bleeding from a gunshot wound to his head. A man stood by her bed, his pistol aimed squarely at her head. "Don't move," he hissed, and after approaching cautiously, he bound Maxine's wrists. While the home invader ransacked the home for valuables, Maxine slowly worked over the bonds on her wrists, suddenly freeing herself while her captor was still distracted. She silently slipped from the bed, reaching under it to where her husband kept a 12-gauge shotgun for home defense. When her captor re-entered the bedroom, Maxine aimed the shotgun at his chest and pulled the trigger. Nothing. To her absolute horror, he'd forgotten to load the shells, and as she frantically pulled the trigger, the only sound to be heard was a faint, dull click. Maxine's captor flew into a rage, pulling out the same .22 he'd used to kill her husband, and shot Maxine 3 times in the chest. As she lay dying, he began to mutilate her with a kitchen knife, carving her eyes out before delicately positioning them in a nearby jewelry box, which he kept as a souvenir. Upon the body's discovery, and the empty .22 bullet casings the killer had left behind, it became evident that a spree killer was quickly evolving into a serial killer, one with a distinct and terrifying modus operandi. 2 months later, in May of 1985, 66-year-old Bill Doy woke up in the middle of the night next to his wife Lillian. Bill heard someone breaking in and rushed to get his home defense weapon when the home invader rushed to cut him off, shooting him in the head with what had become a signature .22 caliber pistol. The invader then entered the Doy's bedroom, where he found Bill's disabled wife Lillian cowering under the covers. Much like his other victims, he beat her, tied her up, then ransacked their home of valuables after he assaulted her. Lillian would survive the attack, but her husband later died of his injuries in the hospital. 83-year-old Mabel Bell would share his fate, dying in a hospital as a result of her injuries. But in the same incident, the Night Stalker would assault the woman's sister, drawing a lipstick pentagram on her thigh before he fled the scene. This was the first time the Night Stalker had made an effort to distinguish himself in his actions as satanic, but it would not be the last. July of 1985 would see two more attacks in which overtly unholy imagery and language were used, but it seems the Night Stalker not only used satanic tropes to terrify both his victims and the wider community, he seems he sincerely believed in them. 63-year-old Joyce Nelson was one of the Night Stalker's next victims, and there's a good chance her life was saved by her willingness to swear on Satan. Ramirez forced her to swear on the dark deity that she revealed the location of all her valuables, and when she did, Ramirez seemed satisfied enough to leave her alive. A second incident took place when the Night Stalker tried to strangle one of his victims with a piece of electrical cord. The cord was apparently plugged into a wall socket at the time, and when it began to snap as a result of the excessive force applied to it, Richard saw a flash of light before the girl was suddenly able to breathe again. Yet, instead of simply finding another means to execute his victim, Ramirez fled the house in terror, later claiming that divine intervention had saved the girl's life. However, it's also clear that the Night Stalker closely followed the media coverage of his crimes, and it's a distinct possibility that he acted in certain ways as to generate as much outrage and controversy as possible. The same interest in his own media coverage also prompted Ramirez to flee Los Angeles when law enforcement's net began to close around him. He fled to his old haunt of San Francisco, murdering Peter and Barbara Pan on the night of August 18th. But it's here that he made his first serious mistake. Ramirez left a size 11.5 shoe print at the scene that detectives matched to a specific pair of rare Avia brand shoes. The case's two lead detectives then contacted the manufacturers, discovering that only 6 of them existed in the size 11.5. 5 of them were shipped to locations in Arizona, and 1 shipped to a shoe store in Los Angeles, making them the only pair of Avias in the state of California. Yet, in an error of catastrophic proportions, San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein leaked this information in a televised press conference. Ramirez promptly dropped his size 11.5 Avias over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's clear the error allowed him to kill additional victims. But Richard's days of killing unhindered were over, and as each day went by, detectives were closer and closer to catching him. The night of August 24th of 1985 would mark the Night Stalker's final home invasion. Ramirez broke into the house of 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his 29-year-old fiancée Inez Erickson before he shot Bill 3 times in the head. Ramirez then turned his attention to Inez, telling her that he was the Night Stalker. She must have been well aware of who that was and must have been terrified as he beat her and forced her to swear that she loved Satan. Before leaving the home, Ramirez told Inez, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Of all those who survived the Night Stalker, perhaps no one gave a better description of her assailant than Inez Erickson. This was then corroborated with a fingerprint taken from a car theft in LA's Koreatown, which was in turn matched with homicide detectives' only confirmed Night Stalker print, and a match was made. The Night Stalker finally had a name and a face, and at a hastily convened press conference, law enforcement addressed him personally, saying, "We know who you are, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide." This seems to be the one time that Ramirez neglected to follow his own story, as on August 30th, he boarded a bus to Arizona, having intended to visit his brother. Yet little did he know, he was the lead story in almost every major media outlet in the country. It's not clear why, but Ramirez failed to meet his brother in Tucson and returned to Los Angeles the following morning. Upon his return, he walked into an East LA convenience store but was stunned into a terrified silence when he heard a group of elderly women refer to him as El Matador, Spanish for the killer. It was only then that he regarded the stack of newspapers, seeing his own face on the cover, after which he fled the store in fright. In order to facilitate his escape, Richard attempted a carjacking, but the woman in the driver's seat recognized him instantly and began to alert bystanders, who in turn chased Richard, struck him over the head with a fence post, and held him down until the police could take him into custody. At his first court appearance in late July of 1988, Richard stunned those in attendance when he raised a pentagram-adorned hand and yelled, "Hail Satan." He also claimed that he had an extensive network of Satan-worshipping supporters and that they'd help him smuggle in a pistol that he'd use to shoot the lead prosecutor. It was a total bluff, but the public was so terrified of Ramirez that metal detectors were installed at the courthouse at considerable cost to the California's taxpayer. And during his trial, the prosecution called psychiatrist Michael Stone as a witness. On the stand, Stone described Ramirez as a made psychopath as opposed to a born psychopath, and that his personality disorders contributed to his indifference to the suffering of his victims. Ramirez's defense attorney backed Stone's assessment, but offered a rather different slant on it, stating that his aggressiveness was the result of being knocked unconscious several times during his childhood, constituting significant damage to his brain's developing frontal lobe. Then on August 14th, one of the trial's jurors failed to show up to the courtroom. Later that day, Phyllis Singletary, the missing juror, was found dead in her apartment. Someone had broken in and shot her. The nation's media went into a frenzy of speculation, purporting that the Night Stalker had the support of a vast network of murderous underground Satanists. It was later confirmed that Singletary was shot and killed by her boyfriend, who later took his own life with the same weapon in a hotel. But that didn't seem to ease any of the jury's fears, with some of them reportedly too scared to return to their homes at night. Finally, on September 20th of 1989, Richard Ramirez was found guilty of all 13 counts of murder and was sentenced to die in California's gas chamber. In response to his sentencing, the Night Stalker released a statement to the media via his attorney. It read, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Due to California's lengthy appeals process when it comes to executions, Ramirez would ultimately avoid the gas chamber, instead dying on June 7, 2013, as the result of complications resulting from lymph node cancer. It was the end of a man who'd taken much more from the world than he'd given back, a man who seemed to be chronically and pathologically fascinated with the macabre. But it seems society's fascination with the man they named the Night Stalker had only just begun. Since his imprisonment and eventual death, Richard Ramirez had been the subject of 3 major motion pictures and 2 highly popular television series. Considering he was a man who relished media attention, it seems we, as a society, had played right into his hands. The Night Stalker craved immortality, and we've given him exactly what he wanted. I used to be a journalist over in California before I moved out here to Boca, and one of the earliest cases I covered was actually one of the first crimes committed by the man that would go on to be named the Golden State Killer. Luckily for me, one of my first cases would probably be one of the most horrifying, and just writing about it scarred me for life. So, the victim had recently moved out to Rancho Cordova to live with her father, but at the time of the attack, her father was away on vacation. The victim told police that just after her father departed, she began to feel like she was being watched. At one point, she was walking in her neighborhood at night when an older, dark, medium-sized American car drove by, slowing as it passed her. And every time she looked to see who it was, the driver would quickly turn his face away. Shortly after these creepy encounters began, she started receiving phone calls late at night. But when she answered, there was only ever silence on the other end. Then, about 4 weeks into her father's absence, the person who had obviously been stalking the woman finally made their move. At approximately 5 p.m. on June 17, 1976, the woman stalker used the railroad tracks near the rear of her home to approach unseen. He then cut the telephone line to the house, then backed off to wait until the sun had set. Once it was dark, and he was sure the woman was home, he crept back towards the house, then used a knife to chip away at the lock of the back door until he gained entry. It's understood he managed to do so almost completely silently because by the time the attack commenced, the stalker had masked up and had undressed completely. His victim was still asleep as he climbed the stairs, approaching the bedroom, and began tapping on the open door with the blade of his knife. The victim said he knew her name and called out to her softly to wake her up. She said at first she thought it was her father, having arrived home early from his trip. But when she sat up to see who it was, her stalker switched on the light, and she let out a scream. She added that, as bizarre as it may seem, she tried to seek refuge from the stalker by pulling the covers over her head, just like a child might do to avoid monsters lurking under their beds. Only this monster was very real, and as he jumped onto the bed, tore the covers off of her, and pressed his knife against her temples so hard it caused blood to trickle down her face, he said, "You make one move, you make one sound, I'll stick this knife in you." Once the victim was compliant, the stalker commanded her to roll over. When she obeyed, he used rope to tightly bind her arms behind her back. Then the assault began in earnest. That night, the man that would come to be known as the Golden State Killer committed unspeakable acts of violence and depravity on his victim, using items of her clothing to further restrain and humiliate her, while he violated her over and over again. When he was done, he seemed to wander around the bedroom aimlessly, panting and breathless as he coldly observed the accoutrements of his victim's life, knickknacks, trinkets, and family photographs. Then suddenly, he moved to exit the room, telling her, "Don't make a move while I'm here, or I'll kill you." After he departed the room, it was a while before his victim dared to move. She awaited her captor's return at any moment, terrified he'd opted to subject her to a more permanent end. But when minutes ticked by and there was still no sign of him, she began to slowly creep towards the bedroom door. Peeking outside, she saw the back door was open, and figuring the coast was clear, she hurtled towards her father's bedroom, kicked the phone off the nightstand, and dialed 911 with her toes. Deputies rushed to the scene of the crime, but the Golden State Killer was long gone. Naturally, the attack caused a huge amount of controversy and media attention, and in order to try and reassure the public, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department held regular community meetings with concerned citizens. Generally, these meetings were used to ease their worries and answer their questions, all the while assuring them that everything in their power was being done to catch the culprit. But as time went on, and police failed time and time again to protect the communities they'd pledged to serve, the local citizens grew more and more frustrated with law enforcement. Then, at one particularly heated meeting, a guy stands up to speak and starts absolutely eviscerating law enforcement, telling them how incompetent they are, how they should all be fired, and for the time being, he mostly has the people on his side. But then, in a bizarrely unfeeling display, the guy turns his fury on the husbands of the victims, asking why they didn't protect their loved ones and implying they were partially to blame for what they had suffered through. Obviously, that didn't go down well with the local populace, who shouted the guy down before forbidding him from contributing again. A few months go by, and an assault very similar to that of the Golden State Killer occurs in the exact same community, and the victim? The wife of the guy who'd stood up to insult the husbands of the victims. Now, I'm not much of a believer in coincidences. If you ask me, someone had deliberately targeted him as a result of what he'd said during the community meeting, which either means that someone was so angered by what he'd said that he decided to let him know how it felt, or the Golden State Killer had been sat in that very same community meeting, listening to every single thing that was being said about him, soaking it all up, figuring out how and when to make his next move. I was in the same room as that guy. I probably looked at him, maybe even shook hands with him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is enough to make my skin want to crawl right off my skeleton. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, it do be like that sometimes.